There is a particular kind of pain that leaves no visible mark. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with drama or ceremony. It comes quietly in the space between a message sent and a message never returned. It settles in the chest like a cold, smooth stone, small enough to ignore during the busy hours of the day, but impossible to forget in the stillness of the night, when the mind grows quiet, and that single unanswered silence fills the entire room. You have felt this. Perhaps you are feeling it right now. That specific ache of reaching toward someone and finding nothing, reaching back. The way your eyes move to your phone without you deciding to look. The way a notification from a stranger lands with a small, involuntary disappointment because it was not the one you were waiting for. The way you replay the last conversation you had, searching for the moment things shifted, trying to locate the exact word or the exact sentence where something between you quietly broke. And the mind, in its desperate attempt to protect you, does what minds always do in the presence of uncertainty. It fills the silence with stories. Maybe you said something wrong, maybe you are too much, or perhaps not enough. Maybe this is what you deserve. Maybe this is simply who you are. Someone people eventually stop responding to. These stories arrive with such conviction, such authority, that it becomes almost impossible to separate what is actually happening from what you are imagining. The silence of another person becomes a verdict about your worth, your lovability, your place in the lives of people who matter to you. But here is what no one tells you clearly enough, what gets lost in the noise of a culture that measures connection by response times and reaction counts. The story is not the silence. The silence is just silence. And the suffering, the real, prolonged, corrosive suffering, does not come from being ignored. It comes from what you do with it inside your own mind. It comes from the narratives you build in the absence of information, the self-judgments you reach for when another person's behavior leaves a gap that feels unbearable to leave empty. This is the first and most important thing to understand, not as a consolation, not as a way to minimize what you feel, but as a genuine doorway towards something freer. If you have been carrying this weight, if the silence of someone you care about has been living in your body as tension, as anxiety, as a low hum of inadequacy that follows you through your days, then what follows is for you. Not rules, not instructions, simply a quieter way of seeing. If these words find you at a moment when you needed them, consider staying close. There is more waiting for you here, more teachings, more gentle wisdom for the moments when life feels heavier than it should. Subscribe and let this be a space you return to whenever the noise becomes too loud. There is an ancient teaching that appears in many forms across centuries of Buddhist wisdom, and it begins not with philosophy, but with something very simple and very human. The observation that we suffer most not from what happens, but from what we tell ourselves about what happens. The meditating teachers who first articulated this were not removed from ordinary pain. They knew heartbreak. They knew the particular loneliness of feeling unseen by someone whose seeing mattered. They understood that the human nervous system is wired at its most fundamental level for belonging, that exclusion, even social exclusion, activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. They did not ask you to stop feeling. They asked you to look more carefully at where the feeling actually comes from. And what they found, after long and honest observation, was this. Most suffering is not located in the event itself. It is located in the interpretation of the event, in the gap between what occurred and the meaning we attach to it, between the silence and the story we build inside that silence. This is not a small distinction. It is, in fact, the entire difference between a life spent at the mercy of other people's behavior and a life lived from a place of quiet, unshakable inner ground. So let us walk through this together, slowly, the way one walks through a forest in the early morning, not rushing toward any destination, but paying attention to what is actually here. The first thing to understand about the pain of being ignored is that not every silence is a rejection. This seems obvious when stated plainly, and yet, in the moment, when the silence belongs to someone you love or someone you long for, the mind almost never treats it as neutral. The mind treats it as information. Specifically, it treats it as confirmation of something you already feared about yourself. This is the nature of anxiety. It does not search for evidence that you are okay. It searches for evidence that confirms the threat. And when it finds ambiguity, a silence, an absence, a distance that cannot be explained, it fills that ambiguity with the darkest available interpretation. But here is what the silence almost never means: that you are unworthy. Here is what it almost always conceals: the interior life of another person, which is as complicated, as burdened, and as distracted as your own. The person who has gone quiet is not, in most cases, sending you a carefully constructed message about your value. They are navigating their own exhaustion, their own fear, their own unresolved grief, their own confusion about what they want and who they are. The silence you are receiving is, far more often than not, a reflection of their inner weather, not a judgment about yours. When you understand this, not as a comfortable story you tell yourself, but as a genuinely likely reality, something in the chest begins to soften. You stop making their silence about you. You allow it to belong to them, and in doing so, you take back something important: the authority to define your own worth. There is a parable that surfaces repeatedly in Buddhist teaching, and it speaks to something precise about the nature of emotional suffering. A man approaches the Buddha in a state of anger and begins to hurl insults, contempt, dismissal. The Buddha listens quietly. Then he asks a simple question: if someone offers you a gift and you choose not to accept it, to whom does the gift belong? To the one who offered it, of course, says the man. The Buddha nods. Then so it is with your contempt. I have chosen not to receive it. It remains yours. This is not a story about stoic coldness. It is not a prescription for emotional suppression or for pretending that being treated with indifference does not sting. It is something subtler and far more powerful, an invitation to recognize that the emotions directed at you by another person are not automatically yours to carry. When someone ignores you, when someone withdraws their attention or their warmth without explanation, they are offering you something. And you have a choice, not always in the first moment, but in the moments that follow, about whether to accept it, whether to take their silence and make it the centerpiece of your own inner life, or to allow it to remain theirs, separate from your sense of who you are. The practice is not to feel nothing. The practice is to notice when you are absorbing someone else's unresolved interior life as though it were a verdict about you, and to gently, deliberately set it back down. This leads naturally to one of the most quietly radical concepts in Buddhist psychology, a word that does not translate easily into English, but that points towards something the English-speaking world desperately needs: upekkha, usually translated as equanimity, but that word is too formal, too marble statue, too cold. What upekkha actually describes is something more like the stillness at the bottom of a lake. The surface of a lake can be turbulent. Storms can pass across it. Stones can be thrown into it, and ripples radiate outward in every direction. But go deep enough, and there is a layer of water that the surface weather never reaches, still, constant, undisturbed, not because it has never been touched by difficulty, but because its nature is deeper than the disturbance. This is what the ancient teachers were pointing toward when they spoke of inner peace that does not depend on external conditions. Not the peace of someone who has arranged life so carefully that nothing ever goes wrong. Not the peace of someone who has stopped caring. The peace of someone who has found something inside themselves that is more fundamental than the approval or disapproval of any other person. A ground beneath the weather, a depth beneath the ripples. When you begin to locate that place, even briefly, even imperfectly, you start to notice that your sense of okayness no longer rises and falls entirely with whether a particular person has responded to your message. It becomes, slowly and genuinely, more yours. Here is a small practice for this. The next time you feel that tightening in the chest that comes from being ignored, pause before reaching for your phone or rehearsing what you might say. Place one hand on your sternum, right at the center. Breathe slowly, all the way down into the belly, and ask yourself quietly, beneath this feeling, beneath this story, is there something in me that is still intact, not performing, not waiting for permission, not depending on a response, just here, steady, present? Usually, if you stay with it long enough, the answer is yes. And that yes is the beginning of equanimity. Not a grand achievement, just a small, honest recognition that the deepest part of you was never actually threatened by the silence. But there is a deeper layer still, one that requires more honesty and more courage than simply observing your thoughts. It requires looking at the nature of the attachment itself. Buddhist teaching uses the word upadana for this, a clinging, a grasping, a particular way of holding on to something so tightly that the holding itself becomes a source of pain. And when it comes to the pain of being ignored, the attachment that causes the most suffering is often this one: the belief that another person's attention is necessary for you to feel whole. This is so common in the modern world that it barely registers as a belief at all. It feels like simple reality. Of course you need people to see you. Of course connection matters. Of course the withdrawal of someone's presence creates pain. All of this is true. Human beings are not meant to live in isolation, and the desire for belonging is not a weakness to be overcome. But there is a difference, and a critical, liberating difference between the natural human need for connection and the specific, suffocating belief that one particular person's response is the measure of your worth. The first is wisdom. The second is a kind of self-constructed cage. When you find yourself unable to feel at ease until a specific person responds, when their silence has the power to undo your entire sense of yourself, you have given them something that was never meant to be given away: the authority over your own inner life. And here is the painful irony, the very desperation that need creates. The anxious energy of someone who requires reassurance often drives away the very connection they are seeking. Because people can feel when they are being held responsible for another person's entire emotional stability. It is a weight most people eventually put down, not because they are cruel, but because it is simply too heavy to carry for long. Releasing this attachment does not mean caring less. It means loving differently. It means finding through practice and through honest self-inquiry a source of steadiness inside yourself that does not require external confirmation to function. Like a tree that draws water from deep roots rather than depending entirely on rain, it still welcomes the rain, still responds to it, still grows more abundantly when it comes. But it does not die in the dry season. It has learned where its water actually lives. There is one more teaching here that deserves to be named, because it is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all, and also the most freeing. The teaching about the difference between reacting and responding, or more precisely, between the voice of the ego and the wisdom of genuine inner strength. When someone ignores you, the ego has a very clear and very loud agenda. It wants to be noticed. It wants to send the message that makes them respond. It wants to withdraw in a way that makes them feel the loss. It wants to prove somehow that the silence was a mistake, that you are worth more than the absence they offered. This is not a character flaw. It is simply the ego doing what egos do, protecting itself through performance, through counter moves, through the frantic attempt to manage how it is perceived. But the ego's strategies almost never produce what they promise. They produce more anxiety, more vigilance, more dependence on the outcome. And they keep you locked in a dynamic where your peace is perpetually contingent on how another person responds to your next move. True strength, the kind that Buddhist teaching has always pointed toward, the kind that is genuinely different from coldness or indifference, is the capacity to pause in the space between the impulse and the action, to feel the pull toward reaction fully without immediately following it, to choose from that paused place something that comes from your values rather than your wounds. Sometimes that means a quiet, neutral response. Sometimes it means saying something honest and direct without urgency or desperation. Sometimes it means genuine silence, not the silence of punishment, but the silence of someone who has found enough ground beneath their feet that they do not need to fill every absence with noise. When you respond from that place, something shifts. Not necessarily in the other person. Their behavior is, as always, outside your control, but in you, in the quality of energy you carry, in the relationship you have with your own interior life. You stop being someone who is managed by the weather of other people's moods and begin slowly to become someone who knows where the ground is, regardless of the weather. There is one more gentle truth before we close, and it may be the most quietly revolutionary of everything said here. It is the teaching that the ancient texts call metta, loving kindness, and in its fullest expression, it points toward a kind of love that most people in this culture have rarely been shown and even more rarely practiced. It is the love that does not require anything in return in order to remain love. Not passive love, not resigned love, not the love of someone who has simply given up hoping for more, but the love of someone who has found, through practice, that their caring for another person is not fundamentally dependent on being cared for back. That it is possible to wish someone well, genuinely, warmly, without bitterness, even when they have chosen silence, even when they have chosen distance, even when they have chosen, for reasons that may never be explained, not to include you in their life. This is not a natural first response. It is a practice. It requires sitting with the hurt long enough that it stops feeling like a verdict and starts feeling like just a feeling. Real, present, temporary, not the final word on who you are. It requires recognizing that the person who is ignoring you is also a person navigating pain, confusion, fear. That their silence is not the action of a fully free and fully conscious being making a clear-eyed choice about your worth, but the action of someone doing the best they can with what they have, which may in this moment be very little. When you can hold that understanding alongside your own hurt, when you can say genuinely, I wish you peace, even now, even in this, you will notice something unexpected. The grip loosens, not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped needing the caring to go one specific direction in order for your own heart to remain open. Practicing this begins with something very small. The next time you feel the sting of being ignored, after you have breathed, after you have placed your hand on your chest and found the ground beneath the weather, try this. Think of the person who is silent and silently offer them a single wish. Not for them to respond, not for them to change, simply, may you find peace. May whatever is heavy in you become lighter. It will feel strange at first. It may feel impossible, but stay with it. Because what you will discover, quietly and with some surprise, is that the wish does not only travel outward, it also lands somewhere in you. It softens the tight place. It reminds you that love, at its most essential, was never about transaction. It was always about the quality of the heart that offers it. These 7 teachings, that silence is rarely what it seems, that you need not accept what is offered in contempt, that equanimity is a depth, not a distance, that your worth is not a currency traded for attention, that attachment to validation is a cage you can choose to open, that responding from strength is always available to you, and that love without demand is the truest freedom. These are not a checklist. They are not a program to complete. They are invitations, offered again and again, to return to something in yourself that was never actually broken by the silence. A light that does not require another person's gaze in order to keep burning. Before the final word, one more invitation. If these teachings have opened something in you, if even one sentence landed somewhere real, stay close to this space. Subscribe, and let this be a place you return to whenever the old patterns begin to stir again, whenever the silence of someone else starts to feel louder than your own inner voice. Your peace was never housed in someone else's response. This is the thing you come back to again and again, until it stops being a thought and starts being something you feel in the body, a loosening, a deepening, a quiet return to yourself that no silence can undo. You do not need to perform for anyone in order to deserve your place in this world. You do not need to wait for confirmation that you are enough. The waiting itself is the only thing keeping you from what you are already in this moment, fully and completely, present, aware, alive, and free. May you carry this lightly. May the next silence you encounter feel less like a closed door and more like an open sky, wide, impersonal, and in no way a reflection of who you are. May your heart stay soft enough to keep loving and strong enough to need no proof that the love is returned. And may you find, in the quiet of your own presence, the one response that was always worth waiting for, your own. If this reflection brought you even a moment of stillness, subscribe and walk this path a little further. There is always more light ahead, and you do not have to find it alone.